Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. So this video is on Aristotle's Nichomachean Ethics. This is the fourth part of the book. What should I do and who should I be is the fundamental question being asked. So Aristotle here is providing an outline of how a human being should behave. So Aristotle was Plato's student, and Plato was Socrates' student. Aristotle rejected certain parts of Plato's philosophy. For example, you won't hear him talking about reincarnation. And he does talk about the good, but not in the same kind of cosmological way that Plato talked about it in the cave allegory. And also Aristotle didn't write dialogues. He wrote just a straightforward treatise of what Aristotle, was trying to communicate. So this Nichomachean Ethics is trying to determine how we should guide our behavior. I'll start reading here on page 432, the section 2, the second paragraph. He says, "If then there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, clearly this must be the good and the chief good. Will not the knowledge of it then have a great influence on life? Shall we not, like archers who have a mark to aim at, be more likely to hit upon what is right? If so, we must try in outline at least to determine what it is, and of which of the sciences or capacities it is the object." So what's the one, if there is, when he says, if then there is some end of the things we do, by end he means purpose or goal. What's the goal of the things we do? And what's the ultimate goal for which all of our other sub-goals are aimed? For example, we have a goal to make money, but we want to make money so we have the capacity to buy things. So it's not, we don't want money for its own sake. It's not that we sit there and just love to look at dollar bills. We then use them to achieve something else. So what's the final goal toward which all of our other goals are aimed? Well, he says, first we need to know which of the sciences that humans have at their capacity or at their disposal would lead to this end. And then he goes on to say politics, political science is the ultimate science because it determines what other sciences will even be studied in the state and who will study them and to what extent. So politics being the master science, whatever the goal of political science is, will be the ultimate goal for humans in general. And then he says, all right, well, what's the goal of political science? And if you look on page 433, paragraph, or at least section 4, he says, "Let us resume our inquiry and state in view of the fact that all knowledge and every pursuit aims at some good. What is it that we say political science aims at, and what is the highest of all goods achievable by action?" Then he'll go on to say all these different ideas of what is good, and then he'll mention Plato's idea of the good here in a second, but continuing, he says, "Verbally there is very general agreement, for both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it is happiness, and identify living well and doing well with being happy. But with regard to what happiness is, they differ, and the many do not give the same account as the wise." A few sentences down, he says, "Now some thought that apart from these many goods, there is another which is self-subsistent and causes the goodness of all of these as well." That was Plato in the cave allegory. But he's not, when he's saying some thought, he's not coming down on that thought. He's not agreeing with that thought about the good is the source of all of the absolute ideas and all of their shadows in the material world. That's not what he's saying. But he is saying the ultimate goal of political science is happiness. But how do you define happiness? So he says, well, there's different forms of happiness corresponding to three different levels of the soul. and that if you're going to be a political scientist, you have to have some basic knowledge of the human soul. Now, when he talks about the human soul, He doesn't say that it lives after death like Plato did, so it's not necessarily a permanent soul. It could, it seems to be a temporary compound of different things, and yet he's just talking about the soul without discussing whether it lives after death. And the three parts of the soul he'll define here on page 434 in section 5. To judge from the lives that men lead, most men and men of the most vulgar type seem not without some ground to identify the good or happiness with pleasure, which is the reason why they love the life of enjoyment. For there are, we may say, three prominent types of life just mentioned: the life of pleasure; two, the political; and thirdly, the contemplative life. So where is the happiness of human beings? He says it can't be found in the pleasure-seeking aspect of life, because that's even suitable for the animals. They seek pleasure as well. Nor can it be part of the political life, which seeks honor, because honor depends on other people bestowing it on you, whereas the good, the ultimate good for humans, is supposed to be something self-sufficient, that's good in and of itself, which would leave you with the third type of life, the contemplative life, or the life of a philosopher. So, if you then look over on page 435, the bottom paragraph, from the point of view of self-sufficiency, the same result seems to follow. For the final good is thought to be self-sufficient. Now, by self-sufficient, we do not mean that which is sufficient for a man by himself, for one who lives a solitary life. No, but it's self-sufficient that you don't seek this thing for the sake of something else. So happiness is the thing we seek for its own sake, not so that we can then accomplish some other goal beyond that. On page 436, the last sentence of that top paragraph: happiness, then, is something final and self-sufficient, and is the end of action. Continuing, he says, presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. For just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or an artist, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function, so would it seem to be for man, if he has a function. But then he'll say, is a man born without a function? The eye has a function, the hand has a function, the foot has a function, but does the whole man not have a function? And then he'll say, if the human being does have a function, it won't be just to grow and to eat, because that animals and plants have. It won't be just a life of perception, sense perceptions, because even the animals have that. Therefore, he says, there remains then an active life of the element that has a rational principle. And so now if the function of man is an activity of soul which follows or implies a rational principle, and then he'll go on, with this long sentence continuing. He says, if this is the case, and we state the function of man to be a certain kind of life, and this to be an activity or action of the soul implying a rational principle, and the function of a good man to be the good and noble performance of these, and if any action is well performed when it is performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, if this is the case, human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. Let this serve as an outline of the good. Okay, so then on page 438, section 9, he says, for this reason also the question is asked whether happiness is to be acquired by learning or by habituation, or some other sort of training, or comes in virtue of some divine providence, or again by chance. And he'll go on to say that virtue is acquired by habit, which is an important part of the Nichomachean ethics. So, for example, he'll say you can be born with the capacity for courage, but just having the potential to be a courageous person doesn't make you, or doesn't give you, the virtue of courage. What gives you the virtue of courage is habitually doing courageous things. At first you might stand your ground in a battle, but you're shaking and you wish you could run, but you don't. If you continue to stand your ground time after time, eventually you'll be habituated to it. It'll become second nature. Then you have the virtue. And on the opposite side of that, if you run away from a fight every time, if you habituate yourself to doing that, you'll eventually have this ingrained habit of cowardice. So habits create virtues, habits create vices. How do we know what is a virtuous type of action? On the bottom of page 443, Book 2, Section 1, it says, virtue then, being of two kinds, intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit. Whence also its name, ethike, which is one that is formed by a slight variation from the word ethos, which means habit. So, a little bit later in the middle of that page in 444, it says, this is confirmed by what happens in states, for legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them. And this is the wish of every legislator, and those who do not affect it miss their mark. And it is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. So, on page 447, section 5, the bottom of the page, he says, next we must consider what virtue is, since things that are found in the soul are of three kinds: passions, faculties, states of character. Virtue must be one of these. So by passions, I mean appetite, anger, fear, confidence. So these are feelings. So passions, faculties, states of character. Passions are the feelings we have. They can't be virtues, because we're not called courageous because we feel anger. We're called courageous when we use our anger to fight for what's right. Faculties is the capacity for, we have the faculty for sight. Our eyes and the optic nerve and the brain, the whole organism of the nervous system, these are faculties. But you're not praised for being virtuous because you have the capacity to be virtuous. I mentioned that earlier. Therefore, that leaves us with states of character. That's what a virtue is. And states of character are developed by habit. Okay, so on page 449, the second from the bottom paragraph, he says, I'll just read this one sentence above the paragraph I was initially intending, because it will be compared to previous readings also, which is one of the discussion questions. He says, for men are good in but one way, but bad in many. Virtue then is the state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. And again, it is a mean because the vices respectively fall short of or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate. Hence, in respect of its substance and the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean with regard to what is best and right and extreme. So, he went through all these, trying to decide what is the good for a human being, and he eventually says the good for a human being is virtue. It's what makes us happy. By being virtuous makes us happy. The Greek word is eudaimonia, health of soul. So it's not just being jolly, but having a healthy soul is what happiness is. And you achieve a happy soul by habitually acting virtuously, and to act virtuously is to use your rational principle of your soul to determine the mean between two extremes, one of deficiency and one of excess. So, for example, courage is a mean, it's a virtue between rashness on the one hand and cowardice on the other. Being ready-witted is a mean between the extreme of buffoonery, of excess, and being a bore, which is deficiency. Being friendly is a mean between the excess being obsequious, and the deficiency of friendliness would be being quarrelsome. So that's how you determine. You use the rational principle of your soul to determine the mean between two extremes in any action, and then habituate yourself to acting according to that mean. You will thereby develop the virtues, which will give you a healthy, happy soul. And that is the ultimate goal of the human being, the final purpose toward which we strive. It's also the goal of political science, to make people happy, or in other words, to make them virtuous, to instill in them the appropriate habits by teaching them to use the rational principle of their soul. Okay, so discussion question 1 on page 455. Compare Aristotle's view to Confucius's doctrine of the mean. What are some of the similarities and differences? Well, obviously, the idea of the mean is a similarity. Confucius said we should try to achieve the mean between two extremes, and that's exactly what we just saw Aristotle say. They both say that the task of achieving the mean is difficult and rare. It's not easy to do. On page 452, section 9, a few sentences down from near the bottom of the page, Aristotle says, "Hence also it is no easy task to be good, for in everything it is no easy task to find the middle." And Confucius says the same thing on page 399, where he talks about the bottom of the page. The master said, "Perfect is the virtue which is according to the mean. Rare have they long been among the people who could practice it. The master said, I know how it is that the path of the mean is not walked in. The knowing go beyond it, and the stupid do not come up to it." So it's not easy to choose the middle path, and it takes constant practice. Both of these, Aristotle and Confucius, were both interested in educating legislators. They were both interested in political science, what makes a good political scientist. Aristotle focused on the rational principle of the soul. Confucius didn't focus on, didn't mention using reason, although he was being rational as he's describing what should be done, but he didn't isolate reason as a separate part of the soul. I'm trying to think of a few more things. One thing is, another similarity is Aristotle said, the virtue is a mean. If you look on page 449, that second to last paragraph, he says, "Hence in respect of its substance and the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean, with regard to what is best and right and extreme." And Confucius you shouldn't moderate your quest to be sincere, said Confucius. You're seeking a mean in your actions, but when it comes to trying to be a sincere person, you should do that to the extreme. And Aristotle's saying the same thing. Don't take virtue itself moderately. It's something that you should focus on all the time. All right, so there's a lot of other ways that you could compare the two. I've given you some examples. I will now go to discussion question 2 on page 455. How does Aristotle's view differ from the 3 views from ancient India? Explain. So there is a big question. The 3 views from ancient India are Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. So how does Aristotle's view differ from them? Well, that makes it easier because he doesn't ask how is it the same and how does it differ. So how does it differ? Well, it differs from all 3 of them because it doesn't mention reincarnation, whereas all 3 of those Indian religions do mention reincarnation. Although Buddhism doesn't believe in an individual soul that survives in any eternal way, and Aristotle also does not mention that, but that's a similarity, so that's not pertinent. Aristotle's view differs from Hinduism specifically because he doesn't mention the supreme personal God. Krishna claims to be the source of the universe. Aristotle does not mention any concept like that, although Aristotle does develop an idea of God in other of his writings, that God is not personally involved with people on earth the way Krishna is. He incarnated on earth, he's talking to Arjuna, so Aristotle has no supreme personal God like Hinduism does. You know, a lot of the similarities are control your sense desires, appear, you know, achieve the mean between extremes, but it's asking for differences, and I've given you the basic differences between them. It differs from Jainism because Aristotle talks about the mean between two extremes, whereas Jainism is an extreme form of nonviolence or ahimsa, which is why it's also different from Buddhism. Okay, so I'll leave that at that and move on to discussion question 3. Explain the nature of the virtues discussed at the end of Book 2. Okay, so that was just the nature of the virtues is they are the mean between two extremes, one of excess and one of deficiency. And also virtues are called states of character. That's what they are. They're a state of your character. They're not a passion. They're not a feeling. They're not a faculty. They're not a capacity for doing something. They are a state of your own character. You are a courageous person. You are a generous person. And they're developed through habit, through using the rational principle of your soul to determine the mean between two extremes of action and acting accordingly. That's what virtues are. Okay, so that will leave that for Aristotle. The next video will be about the writing by Epicurus, and we will come back to that.